As the largest and most flawlessly functioning military logistical machine of the ancient world attempted to wipe the European continent off the map, drying up the rivers it drank from and crossing seas with bridges. Was this massive series of conflicts truly an ideological war between democracy and despotism? Or was the direction of history determined not by sword strikes, but by the tonnage capacity of horse transport ships, the engineering mathematics of pontoon bridges built over the sea, and the ruthless logistical expiration date imposed upon an army by the approaching winter season? For centuries, historiography has popularized the Greco-Persian Wars through legends, epic tragedies of 300 men, and myths of heroism. However, the forensic records of military history rely on a cold mechanics, completely stripped of emotions. In this massive academic analysis, fictional myths will be entirely set aside, and a pure evaluation of logistics, military engineering, and hydrodynamics will be reflected on the screen. We begin the process in the year 490 before Christ, with that initial spark that directed the administrative apparatus of the Achaemenid Empire westward, as the burning of the city of Sardis transformed directly into a casus belli. In this amphibious operation, which was the revenge of Darius I, every detail will be examined with millimetric precision, from the logistical limits of the Hippogoi transport ships, carrying thousands of horses across the Aegean Sea, to the tactical waiting period on the plain of Marathon, and the biomechanical necessities enforced upon Greek heavy infantry to cross the kill zone. But Marathon was merely a beginning. Exactly 10 years later, in the year 480, before Christ, the empire returned under the command of Xerxes I, this time with a massive biological mass ranging between 150,000 and 300,000 men. You will witness the engineering brilliance of the Hellespont pontoon bridges, consisting of 674 ships that enabled the passage from Asia to Europe, how the army advanced by literally drying up water sources like the Lissus River, and how the clash at the Thermopylae Pass was not a fictional heroism, but a flawless strategic maritime integration established with the Athenian navy. With the collapse of the northern defense lines, the fall of Attica, and the reduction of Athens to ashes, might have seemed like an absolute victory, but it harbored a fatal mathematical flaw within itself. The daily caloric and fresh water needs of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and tens of thousands of horses made the Persian army absolutely dependent on naval supply lines. When the calendars showed the month of September, the fact that the approaching winter storms would close the sea to transportation dragged Xerxes into a logistical dead end, racing against time in the narrow waters of Salamis. The hydrodynamic vulnerabilities created by the high center of gravity of the Phoenician warships, and how numerical superiority was reduced to zero in a geographical funnel, will be laid out on the table in the light of purely physical parameters. But before we dive into these ruthless pages of history written by wind, wood, and logistical mathematics, a brief note. Due to our current technical phase, we unfortunately do not have direct control over the advertisements. However, to ensure that your deep focus remains unbroken and that your sleep is never interrupted in the late hours of the night, our primary goal is to take full control as soon as possible and completely eliminate all mid-roll ads. To help us accelerate this process and expand this independent archive, you can support us by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Because history is resurrected right now, in the minds of those of you listening to these words from different corners of the world, at different hours of the day. Leave your own mark on this silent anatomy table by noting down your current geography and time. If you are ready, we are starting the process towards the center of that great military storm where Asia flowed into Europe. Setting sail from the Cilician shores into the briny waters of the Aegean, this colossal fleet represented one of the most complex maritime transport operations of antiquity. Comprising 600 triremes and hundreds of horse transport vessels, this armada was not merely a military force, but a massive biological mechanism that required constant sustenance. The greatest obstacle facing commanders Datis and Artaphernes was not the enemy's swords, but the daily consumption requirements of this very mechanism. A single Persian trireme carried approximately 170 rowers and 30 marines. The human manifest alone for a fleet of 600 ships exceeded 120,000 personnel. In order for the rowers to counteract the strong currents of the Aegean, an average daily energy intake of between 3,500 and 4,000 calories per man was required. Furthermore, beneath the scorching summer heat, a minimum of 2 liters of fresh water was necessary for each crew member, while each horse mandated 20 to 30 liters. In total, a minimum of 250 tons of fresh water and dozens of tons of grain had to be consumed every 24 hours. Given that the cargo capacities of ancient warships were practically negligible, the fleet could not navigate the open sea for consecutive days. This logistical reality directly dictated the campaign's route, compelling the Persians to advance along island coastlines, disembarking every evening to replenish water supplies and rest the horses. The most delicate element of the amphibious operation, the horses, were transported in converted obsolete warships designated as hippogoi. To prevent the animals from succumbing to seasickness and fracturing their legs from the turbulence generated by the waves, specialized suspension systems were installed within the hulls of the vessels. The horses were secured to these slings, thereby lifting their weight off their hooves and preventing a fatal loss of balance throughout the days-long voyage. This fragile system necessitated that the fleet avoid severe storms and traverse the Aegean Sea by hopping from one island to the next. In the midsummer of 490 BCE, the fleet arrived at the island of Naxos. The island, which had been the site of an unsuccessful Persian siege a decade prior, was now met with the full, unmitigated force of the Achaemenid machine. As the populace fled into the mountains, those who remained were put to the sword, and the city, along with its temples, was reduced to ashes. The incineration of Naxos served as the opening maneuver in the psychological warfare phase of the campaign. However, upon the fleet's arrival at the sacred island of Delos, Commander Datis exhibited a calculated strategic tolerance. The island, revered as the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, was left untouched, and massive quantities of frankincense were offered to the temples. This maneuver was a deliberate political message broadcast to the Greek world, declaring that the Persians harbored no blind animosity toward the Hellenic belief system. The objective was exclusively Athens and Eretria, the states that had defied imperial authority. As the fleet reached Euboea, the city of Eretria, the first primary target of the expedition, came into view. The Persian forces disembarked, and the horses, unloaded from the hippogoi, were released onto the Eretrian plains to recover, following days of immobilization. Comprehending that engaging a massive infantry and cavalry force in open combat would amount to tactical suicide, the Eretrian populace opted to withdraw behind their city walls. The ensuing siege persisted for 6 consecutive days with relentless, bloody, and mechanical violence. While Persian engineers battered the fortifications, the archer contingents subjected the city to continuous ballistic pressure. At the conclusion of the 6th day, with both sides having sustained heavy casualties, the siege culminated in betrayal on the 7th. Two Eretrian aristocrats, Euphorbus and Philagris, opened the city gates to the Persians. Following the treason, the infiltrating Achaemenid infantry exacted the revenge of Sardis with absolute precision. Temples were razed, the city was plundered, and the surviving Eretrians were placed in chains, destined for exile in the region of Elam. With the fall of Eretria, only a narrow maritime strait remained between the Persian army and the campaign's ultimate objective, Athens. At this juncture, the deposed Athenian tyrant Hippias intervened. Exiled from Athens years prior, Hippias was utilizing the Persians to facilitate his return and the subsequent reclamation of power. He was the architect behind the decision to anchor the Persian fleet in the Bay of Marathon, located 42 kilometers northeast of the city, rather than launching a direct naval assault on Athens. Marathon proved to be an impeccable location for Persian logistical and tactical doctrine. The bay possessed a broad, crescent-shaped shoreline that allowed the massive 600-ship fleet to anchor securely, sheltered from the violent Etesian winds. Upon disembarkation, the Persian army was met by a flat plain, roughly 10 kilometers in length and 3 kilometers in width, flanked by the great and small marshes. This geography constituted an ideal expanse for the cavalry, the most potent and lethal strike force of the Persian army, to maneuver and outflank the Greek heavy infantry. Moreover, according to Hippias's political calculations, the Athenian army would be forced to depart the city and march to Marathon, affording Hippias's loyalists within Athens the time and opportunity to instigate a rebellion and open the city gates from within. As the bows of the ships grounded upon the shores of Marathon, thousands of infantrymen and hundreds of horses set foot on the Greek mainland. The colossal machine of the Achaemenid Empire had taken its position and commenced its wait for Athens to make her move. When the intelligence regarding the fall and incineration of Eretria through treachery reached the Athenian assembly, political mechanisms were immediately activated. The city was acutely aware that the final physical barrier separating it from the colossal army of the Achaemenid Empire had been eliminated. The anchoring of the Persian fleet in the Bay of Marathon confirmed that the crisis was no longer a theoretical debate, but an imminent threat of annihilation. At this juncture, the Athenian administration was compelled to resort to the most critical, logistical, and communicative apparatus of the ancient Greek world, the human body. One of the professional couriers, designated as a hemerodromos, or day runner, named Phidippides, was dispatched southward to solicit the military assistance of Sparta. This action was far beyond a mere transmission of a message. It constituted an endurance test pushing the absolute boundaries of human biomechanics. The distance of approximately 240 kilometers between Athens and Sparta traversed the rugged Argolis terrain, precipitous mountain passes, and the arduous inclines of Mount Parthenion. According to historical data and modern sports physiology calculations, it is deduced that Phidippides must have covered this distance in roughly 36 hours, subsisting on minimal hydration and basic carbohydrate consumption. However, the response received in exchange for this phenomenal physical exertion was a profound strategic disappointment. Despite being the most disciplined military machine of the era, Sparta simultaneously possessed a state structure rigidly bound by strict religious statutes and constitutional taboos. The period during which Phidippides reached Sparta coincided with the sacred timeframe spanning late August to early September, wherein the festival of the Carneia was observed. Dedicated to Apollo Carneos, this festival was entirely dependent on the lunar cycle, specifically the position of the full moon. Spartan law strictly prohibited the army from marching out of the city on a campaign prior to the appearance of the full moon in the night sky. This religious regulation was not merely a symbolic belief, but an immutable constitutional article tethering the survival of the state to the will of the gods. The ephors, the Spartan magistrates, pledged their assistance, yet formally declared their obligation to await the full moon before initiating the army's deployment. This temporal constraint dictated that Athens would be forced to face the Persian army alone or endure a tactical wait for a minimum of 1 week. Upon receiving the intelligence of Sparta's delay, the Athenian military council arrived at a critical strategic crossroad. Withdrawing behind the city walls to endure a siege carried the inherent risk of starvation and internal betrayal, medism, precisely mirroring the precedent set by Eretria. The probability of Hippias's sympathizers within Athens opening the city gates to the Persians was assessed as a far more lethal threat than the Achaemenid swords outside. Consequently, the resolution was passed for the Athenian army to march out of the city, intercept the Persians at their disembarkation point on the plain of Marathon, and physically block their advance. Approximately 9,000 Athenian hoplites, bearing bronze panoplies weighing between 20 and 30 kilograms, massive aspis shields, and dory spears, completed the 42-kilometer deployment. They were augmented by a contingent of 1,000 fully equipped heavy infantrymen from the small but loyal allied city of Plataea. Upon reaching Marathon, rather than descending directly into the plain, this combined military force of 10,000 executed a stroke of geographical positioning genius, establishing their encampment at the foothills of the Agriliki and Catroni mountains, collectively known as the Vrana Mountains. This geographical positioning was by no means accidental. By anchoring their rear against steep crags and dense woodland terrain, the Athenian army effectively neutralized the Persians' greatest advantages: numerical superiority and maneuverability. The arboreal density at the foothills rendered a massed assault by Persian cavalry physically impossible, while the gradient of the slopes functioned as a natural barrier, destined to shatter the momentum of any Achaemenid infantry charge initiated from the low ground. Furthermore, by maintaining this static position, the Athenian army physically obstructed both primary routes leading from Marathon to Athens. The Persians were rendered incapable of initiating a land march toward the city without first annihilating or dislodging the Athenian force. Once both armies had assumed their positions, one of the most prolonged tactical stalemates in ancient military history commenced. Enduring for approximately 8 days, this impasse was predicated upon the mutual understanding that initiating the first maneuver would equate to tactical suicide. For the Greeks, descending into the plain was an open invitation for Persian horsemen to flank and fracture the infantry phalanx. Conversely, for the Persians, launching a frontal uphill assault within a confined space against a heavy bronze-armored wall utilizing only light wicker shields would have constituted a massive logistical waste. This extended period of inertia exerted a colossal consumption pressure upon the supply chains of both armies. The Greek army of 10,000 was compelled to consume approximately 15 tons of provisions and tens of thousands of liters of water daily. This supply line could be sustainably maintained via mule caravans, traversing the secure mountain passes to their rear, drawing from the agricultural hinterland of Athens. Within the Persian camp, however, the situation had deteriorated into a critical logistical countdown. The consumption rate of the 600-ship naval crew, tens of thousands of soldiers, and most critically, thousands of horses, was of monumental proportions. Although the Macaria spring on the plain of Marathon partially fulfilled their hydration requirements, the grazing of thousands of horses decimated the available pasture land within a matter of days. To preserve their operational efficacy, the cavalry required that the horses maintain their conditioning, thereby necessitating constant sustenance. Time, from a logistical standpoint, favored the Athenians, while operating severely against the Persians. During these days of stagnation, a highly complex constitutional procedure was underway within the Greek command tent. The administration of the Athenian army was structured upon the 10-tribe system instituted by the reforms of Cleisthenes. Each tribe was commanded by a general holding the title of strategos, and presiding over these 10 generals was the commander-in-chief, designated as the polemarchos. Supreme command authority rotated daily among the 10 generals. A complete political schism manifested during the voting within the Council of War. 5 generals advocated for maintaining the defensive posture and awaiting the arrival of the Spartan army, while the remaining 5 cast their votes in favor of initiating an immediate offensive. The faction championing the offensive was led by Strategos Miltiades, a commander who had previously fought alongside the Persian army in the Thracian region, thereby acquiring first-hand observational intelligence regarding Achaemenid military doctrine, infantry tactics, and command vulnerabilities. Miltiades' argument was not purely military, but heavily socio-political. He vehemently contended that every day of delay eroded the army's morale and, more perilously, amplified the probability that the aristocratic sympathizers of Hippias within Athens would be emboldened to orchestrate a coup d'etat within the city walls. The scenario of treachery that had befallen Eretria had mutated into a palpable dread within the minds of the soldiers at Marathon. In this moment of deadlock, where the votes were split 5-5, the final and decisive authority devolved to the polemarch Callimachus in accordance with constitutional procedure. Miltiades delivered a historic strategic briefing to Callimachus to break the tie, presenting rational data to assert that the fate of the city and the future of the democracy hinged upon this single vote, and that continued waiting would culminate in logistical decay and political treason. Callimachus cast the 11th vote, breaking the equilibrium in favor of the offensive. The resolution was enacted. However, to execute the maneuver, Miltiades would defer until the rotation of his own day of command and wait for the tactical conditions on the plain, specifically the movements of the Persian cavalry, to present the optimal mathematical equation for an assault. This 8-day war of attrition, bordering on the absolute limits of logistical consumption, was on the precipice of giving way to one of the most violent mechanical collisions of the ancient world. On that critical morning of 490 BCE, corresponding to late August or early September in the lunar calendar, the tactical equation of the plain of Marathon was abruptly altered. Greek reconnaissance elements, having waited at the foothills for 8 days, reported significant movement within the Persian camp on the plain. Intelligence relayed to the Greek command tent, whether by Ionian-born spies or informants slipping through the lines under the cover of darkness, was recorded in military terminology as chorus hippes, meaning the cavalry is away. The underlying cause of this absence of cavalry, one of the most debated subjects in ancient military history, is still elucidated by various theories within academic circles. The first theory suggests that the Persian commander Datis, in order to break the tactical gridlock, loaded his most lethal strike force, the cavalry, onto ships under the cover of night, aiming to launch a direct naval shock assault on Athens. The second, and logistically more robust theory, posits that the consumption of the limited pasture land on the plain by tens of thousands of horses necessitated the withdrawal of the cavalry miles away from the camp to the northern edge of the plain in search of fresh water and forage. Regardless of the exact cause, the mobile force that protected the Persian flanks and provided maneuver superiority had temporarily departed the plain. The tactical window that Miltiades had anticipated for days had finally opened, whether as a consequence of a military blunder or a logistical imperative. Once the resolution for an offensive was established, Commander-in-Chief Callimachos and strategist Miltiades were compelled to confront a purely mathematical and geometric problem before deploying their forces onto the plain. The Greek army's complement consisted of 10,000 heavy infantry, including the 1,000-strong Plataean contingent. In traditional Greek martial doctrine, the hoplite phalanx was constituted of a dense rectangular formation, 8 ranks deep, with interlocking shields. When an army of 10,000 is arrayed at a depth of 8 ranks, it forms a front line of approximately 1,250 men. Calculating the average 90-centimeter lateral space occupied by each soldier, the total width of the Greek battle line remained slightly over 1 kilometer. Conversely, the opposing Persian infantry line was arrayed parallel to the sea as a massive wall, extending approximately 1.5 kilometers in length. Had the Greeks descended into the plain, preserving their traditional formation, the Persian frontage would have overlapped the Greek line on both flanks, ultimately enveloping and annihilating the Greek army through the physical pressure of numerical superiority within minutes. This mathematical certainty forced the Greek command echelon to enact a doctrinal revolution. Callimachos was obligated to extend his frontage to equalize the length of the Persian line. The solution was found by deliberately sacrificing the depth of the army's center. While the right flank under the personal command of Callimachos and the left flank controlled by the Plataeans were maintained at the traditional depth of 8 ranks, the center line, comprising the Leontis and Antiochus tribes, was thinned down to a mere 3 or 4 ranks. This radical deployment was not so much the product of military genius as it was an obligatory geometric stretching implemented to avert a double envelopment. The center line was elongated at the cost of physical attenuation, and the frontal widths of the two armies were equated. In the advancing hours of the morning, thousands of Greek hoplites, clad in bronze panoplies, weighing between 20 and 30 kilograms, greaves and muscled cuirasses, commenced their descent from the slopes of the Vrana mountains toward the plain. This march harbored one of the most intimidating rhythms of the ancient world, the percussive sound of spears striking the wooden cores of shields during the advance of the phalanx, synchronized with the impact of thousands of bronze-clad feet upon the earth, was an auditory manifestation of psychological warfare. As the distance between the two armies contracted, the tempo of the march had to be maintained with millimeter precision, for the strength of the phalanx resided not in the individual capabilities of the men, but in the seamless integrity of the shield wall. When the distance separating the two armies dwindled to approximately 200 meters, the mechanics of this documentary-like advance were forced to change radically. The military backbone of the Persian army consisted of the Sparabara units, defensive infantry bearing massive wicker shields in the front, immediately backed by elite archers. The effective kill zone of Persian composite bows, sophisticated weapons manufactured through the lamination of wood, horn, and animal sinew, ranged between 150 to 200 meters. The moment the Greek army entered this range, the sky would darken with thousands of arrows, and a slowly advancing phalanx would sustain devastating casualties while lingering beneath this ballistic downpour for minutes. Cognizant of this ballistic reality, the Greek command echelon issued an order previously unprecedented in history: dromos. That is, to break into a run the moment the kill zone was breached. The execution of this command was a test of endurance that pushed the absolute limits of human biomechanics, sprinting a distance of 200 meters, while bearing a bronze cuirass weighing an average of 15 kilograms, carrying an oak-cored, bronze-faced aspis shield weighing 7 to 8 kilograms on the left arm, and gripping a 2.5-meter ash-wood dory spear in the right hand, induced a colossal accumulation of lactic acid within the muscle tissues. More critically, the Corinthian-style bronze helmet, which entirely encased the head, leaving only narrow slits for the eyes and mouth, restricted the massive oxygen consumption required during the sprint by nearly 60%. The soldiers' field of vision was reduced to 70 degrees, and their auditory senses were deafened by the reverberation of their own respirations and the clatter of armor. Regardless of how severe the physical toll may have been, this tactic yielded a flawless success from a ballistic standpoint. The duration of the Greek phalanx's exposure within the kill zone was reduced to mere seconds, rendering the rate of fire of the Persian archers inadequate against this sudden acceleration. Furthermore, the structural design and metallurgy of the Persian arrows were unsuited for this scenario. The composite bows fired lightweight, reed-shafted arrows designed to strike unarmored or lightly armored targets from distances of hundreds of meters. The kinetic energy of these arrows, descending in a parabolic arc from the sky, and the armor-piercing capabilities of their bronze or iron tips were physically insufficient to penetrate the thick bronze plating or the wood-cored aspis shields borne by rapidly charging hoplites. The tens of thousands of arrows discharged generated a terrifying metallic cacophony among the Greek ranks, embedding themselves in shields and ricocheting off armor, yet failing to inflict a fatal loss of cohesion. Anticipating a slow and lumbering target, the Persian infantry were abruptly confronted by a 10,000-strong mass hurtling toward them at high velocity, preparing to crash down like a colossal wave of bronze. In the final meters of the sprint, spears were lowered into a horizontal combat position, and shields were drawn tightly against chests. The collision of these two masses marked the exact moment military strategy ceased, and pure physical violence, kinetic mass transfer, and the penetration of metal into metal commenced. The moment of impact between the Greek heavy infantry and the Persian light infantry transitioned from a tactical maneuver into a problem of pure physics and mass transfer, as the kinetic energy of the accelerating 10,000-strong bronze mass in the final phase of the sprint collided with the wood-reinforced wicker shields of the Achaemenid Empire units. The initial mechanical shock of the battle was registered. The 2.5-meter Greek spears provided a lethal range advantage over the shorter weapons of the Persian soldiers, and the pushing force of the shield wall, Othismos, began to crush the Achaemenid front lines. However, this physical superiority did not progress with equal stability across every point of the 1.5-kilometer front line. Specifically, the Greek center line had been deliberately thinned to a depth of 3 or 4 ranks during the earlier phases of the battle to equalize the frontal width. This weakened center, comprised of the Leontis and Antiochus tribes, found itself confronted by the most elite, armored, and disciplined warriors of the Achaemenid army. Ethnic Persian infantrymen and elite axe-wielding Saka units. Lacking depth, the Greek center was unable to hold its ground against the shield push and numerical pressure of the Persian elites, beginning to yield and retreat step by step. From this point forward, the battle was no longer an application of strategy, but a mere autopsy table where flesh, bone, and bronze violently intersected. During this chaotic melee, King Leonidas of Sparta succumbed to countless blows and perished. In ancient military doctrine, the corpse of a king or commander-in-chief represents a massive psychological and political prize for both factions. The moment Leonidas's lifeless body fell to the earth, the entire physical momentum of the battle centralized around the right wing, under the command of Commander-in-Chief Callimachos, and the left wing, manned by the Plataeans, pulverized the comparatively lightly armored Persian flanks opposite them, forces primarily consisting of forcefully conscripted Ionians and other imperial subjects, with overwhelming mass pressure. Unable to withstand the momentum generated by the heavy bronze shields, the Persian flanks shattered, and the soldiers initiated a disorganized flight toward the ships. In ancient warfare, pursuing and annihilating a broken enemy is the most prevalent instinctual behavior. Yet the Greek flanks at Marathon demonstrated the pinnacle of military discipline. Rather than chasing the fleeing Persian wings, they halted, executed a 90-degree inward pivot, and closed in upon the Persian main force that was currently crushing their own center. This maneuver constituted a millimeter-precise pincer operation that would be cemented in military historiography as a double-envelopment. The elite Persian and Saka units, advancing under the illusion of a central victory, were abruptly confronted by a bronze wall of thousands of heavy infantry closing in from their right and left flanks. Simultaneously, the weakened Greek center that they had been pushing back stiffened its resistance, halting the retreat. The finest soldiers of the Achaemenid Empire were surrounded on 3 sides, stripped of their maneuverability, and confined within a claustrophobic killbox. From this moment onward, the battle ceased to be a display of tactical discipline. It devolved into a suffocating, blinding, and mechanical slaughter where spears shattered, giving way to the close-quarters work of short swords. Xephus. The chain of command within the encircled Persian ranks collapsed entirely within minutes. The soldiers trapped within the compressed mass were rendered incapable of wielding their weapons, and a wave of panic from the rear infected the entire army. The Achaemenid units that managed to break through the encirclement, or those situated outside of it, initiated a chaotic, routed flight toward the fleet in the rear. However, the geography of the plain of Marathon presented yet another lethal barrier to the fleeing army. Thousands of retreating Persian soldiers were driven into the great and small marshes located at the northern and southern extremities of the plain. Sinking into the heavy mud, losing all sense of orientation, and caught by the relentless pursuit of the Greek hoplites closing in from behind, a vast portion of these Achaemenid troops perished, either drowning in the mire or being impaled by spears. The final phase of the debacle consisted of the chaotic and bloody beach clashes between the Persians attempting to reach their vessels and the Greeks striving to intercept them. The instant the Persian sailors witnessed the disintegration of the army, they severed the mooring lines securing the ships to the shore and threw themselves onto the oars, propelling the vessels toward the open sea. The skirmishes on the shoreline were exceptionally ferocious. It was in this beach engagement that the commander-in-chief of the Greek army, Polemarch Callimachos, entered the historical record by dying literally on his feet, his body impaled by countless arrows and spears. The Greek efforts to capture the vessels by hauling on the severed ropes largely failed due to the organized and rapid response of the Persian crews. Amidst the chaos of tens of thousands of fleeing soldiers on the beach, the Greek forces managed to capture a mere 7 ships out of the 600-vessel fleet. The main body of the armada successfully set sail, salvaging thousands of soldiers and the command echelon. When the dust and turmoil of the collision subsided, the forensic tableau remaining on the plain of Marathon distinctly summarized the mechanics of the battle. As verified by historical sources and archaeological examinations, the corpses of 6,400 Achaemenid soldiers were counted within the marshes and across the plain. In stark contrast, the total casualties sustained by the Greek army amounted to exactly 192 Athenian and 11 Plataean hoplites. This lethal statistic, reflecting a ratio of approximately 31-1, corroborated the fundamental axiom of ancient warfare. The vast majority of casualties do not occur while soldiers are engaged face to face. Rather, they are inflicted when the formation collapses and the army turns its back, namely, during the flight and the rout. The 192 Athenians who perished on the battlefield were cremated, and their ashes, along with their weaponry, were interred beneath a massive earthen tumulus known as the Soros, which still rises upon the plain of Marathon today. However, this statistical victory upon the battlefield did not signify the conclusion of the war. The Persian fleet, having sailed into the open water, oriented its course not back toward Asia, but to the south. Although the physical collision phase of the battle had concluded upon the plain of Marathon, the strategic crisis was only just beginning. The ground elements of the Persian army had suffered a severe defeat, with thousands of infantrymen buried within the mire of the marshes. However, the most formidable asset at the disposal of the Achaemenid command echelon, the naval fleet, remained largely intact. Once Commander Datis had regrouped his vessels in the open waters following the chaotic retreat on the beach, he initiated a highly rational and lethal tactical maneuver. The surviving armada of the 600-ship fleet altered its course, heading not east toward the shores of Asia, but south toward Cape Sunion, at the extremity of the Attica Peninsula. The objective was Athens itself, a city situated 42 kilometers away and left entirely defenseless. According to historical records and forensic case analyses, as the Persian fleet set sail, the reflection of a polished bronze shield catching the sun was observed upon the slopes of Mount Pentelicus. This optical signal, highly probable to have been orchestrated by Hippias's sympathizers within Athens, likely the affluent Achaemenidae family, conveying the message that the city is defenseless, make haste, instantaneously transmuted the anatomy of the war from a bloody shield push into a logistical race against time. Navigating around Cape Sunion to reach the primary port of Athens, Phaleron Bay, necessitated a maritime voyage of approximately 120 kilometers. The duration required for the Persian triremes to traverse this distance, utilizing wind and oar power, corresponded almost exactly to the time frame required for the Athenian army to march the 42-kilometer overland route to secure the thousands of corpses, the massive accumulation of spoils, and the prisoners upon the battlefield. The Antiochus tribe, under the command of Aristides, was left behind. The remaining force of approximately 9,000 heavy infantry was immediately issued orders for a forced march. This deployment constituted an absolute subjugation of human physiology and biomechanical endurance. An army that had sprinted through the kill zone that very morning, endured hours of mechanical and traumatic hand-to-hand combat, suffered severe dehydration and sustained wounds, was now compelled to march across mountainous and rugged terrain within a matter of hours, under the scorching Greek sun, without shedding their 20-kilogram armor. The fate of Athens no longer rested upon the tips of spears, but rather upon the lactic acid tolerance in the soles of these hoplites' feet and their pulmonary capacities. During the later hours of that same day, as the civilian populace within Athens watched in terror, as hundreds of Persian sails materialized on the southern horizon, a colossal dust cloud rising from the northern mountain passes served as the physical harbinger of the city's salvation. Miltiades, who had assumed de facto command following the death of Callimachus on the battlefield, drove the army with superhuman exertion, successfully arriving in Athens mere moments before the Persian fleet. Thousands of exhausted, heavy infantrymen, caked in dust, mud, and blood, arrayed themselves in battle formation upon the commanding slopes descending into Phaleron Bay, in the vicinity of the sanctuary of Heracles at Cynosargis. As the Achaemenid fleet, under the command of Datis and Artaphernes, approached Phaleron Bay, they observed that the shoreline was not deserted. The very same bronze-armored phalanx that they had failed to break at Marathon, by which they had been tactically defeated, now stood before them on the Athenian coast, as an impregnable wall seemingly sprung from the earth. For the Persian admirals, this spectacle was the mathematical proof that the operational window of strategic opportunity had definitively closed. To disembark the fleet and re-engage in mechanical combat against these heavy infantrymen positioned on high ground would have amounted to logistical and military suicide. The vessels held their position offshore, leeward of the wind, for a brief period. Subsequently, Datis issued the final order to withdraw. The armada directed its course eastward, into the waters of the Aegean, and onward toward the continent of Asia. Thus, the Battle of Marathon concluded. However, this intelligence, echoing through the Achaemenid palaces in Susa and Persepolis, was not recorded as an imperial collapse, but rather as a regional and unacceptable insult directed at the administrative apparatus. Darius I defined this defeat as a chronic border anomaly that tarnished imperial prestige and immediately authorized a massive military buildup that would drain the resources of all satrapies. Although Darius's biological lifespan would not suffice to witness the execution of this new campaign, his heir, Xerxes I, would inherit this administrative and military legacy a decade later to complete the unfinished execution. The tactical victory achieved upon the muddy plain of Marathon temporarily spared Greece from absolute annihilation. Yet, it sowed the seeds of a far greater, far darker logistical storm, the narrow, desperate shield wall at the pass of Thermopylae. As the colossal human and material mass of Asia advanced toward the Greek mainland like a seismic wave, the fragmented Greek city-states, chronically at war with one another, exhibited a rare political reflex in the face of an existential threat of annihilation. In the autumn of 481 BCE, the Pan-Hellenic Congress convened at the Isthmus of Corinth under the leadership of Sparta, representing a critical turning point in the diplomatic history of the ancient Greek world. At this Congress, 31 adversarial city-states suspended all their blood feuds and convened to formulate a unified defense doctrine to halt the Achaemenid invasion. The initial strategic resolution dictated the defense of the Vale of Tempe, situated in the northern region of Thessaly. A Greek heavy infantry force of approximately 10,000 men deployed northward to intercept the Persian army at this narrow pass. However, military intelligence swiftly invalidated the theoretical advantages of the geography. Likely as a result of covert warnings from King Alexander I of Macedon, it was realized that the Vale of Tempe could be easily outflanked by the Persian army, utilizing alternative mountain passes in the vicinity. Unwilling to fall into a double-envelopment trap, the Greek command echelon immediately issued an order for a strategic withdrawal, abandoning the region of Thessaly to the mercy of the Persians, a process synonymous with Medism, submission to the Medes. Following this strategic retreat, the Athenian statesman and naval architect Themistocles presented a flawless geographical blueprint that would enter military historiography as the dual defense lock. According to Themistocles' analysis, there existed only one topographical funnel where the numerical superiority of the Achaemenid army could be entirely neutralized: the gateway to central Greece, Thermopylae, or the Hot Gates. Yet this land-based defense possessed zero tactical value in isolation. As long as the Persian fleet maneuvered freely at sea, Persian vessels advancing along the coastline could disembark troops behind the Greek army defending Thermopylae, enveloping the ground forces within seconds. Therefore, Themistocles proposed that the unified Greek fleet, spearheaded by Athens, blockade the Strait of Artemisium, located immediately northeast of Thermopylae. This plan constituted an unparalleled strategic symbiosis. The fleet at sea secured the flank of the land army, while the land army prevented the Persians from seizing naval bases. Should one fall, the other would instantly lose its tactical significance and be annihilated. The resolution was adopted, and the lethal locking mechanism designated to halt the Persian machine was marked upon the map. An examination of the geographical anatomy of the pass of Thermopylae reveals the millimeter-precise nature of this military calculation. The coastline, which has expanded for kilometers today due to alluvial deposits, possessed an entirely different topography in 480 BCE. The pass consisted of an exceedingly narrow coastal corridor squeezed between the steep, impassable cliffs of Mount Calidromus to the south and the deep waters of the Malian Gulf to the north. Along this corridor lay three distinct gates, chokepoints, where the mountains approached closest to the sea. At the area known as the Middle Gate, the physical width of the pass narrowed to a mere 15 meters. For the Persian mass of hundreds of thousands to force itself into this 15-meter gap was tantamount to an ocean attempting to flow through a narrow pipe. Furthermore, the odor of rotten eggs and noxious gases emanating from the region's sulfurous hot springs, from which the Hot Gates derived their name, transformed this geography into an almost natural depiction of hell. When the Greek vanguard force, commanded by King Leonidas I of Sparta, arrived at the pass, it did not consist of a mere 300 men, as pop culture purports. The complement of the unified Greek, Pan-Hellenic army comprised approximately 7,000 heavy infantrymen, hoplites. The core of the army was formed by 300 elite Spartan hippies, royal guard, personally selected by Leonidas, all of whom had living male heirs, Surrounding this core, however, were 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and thousands of Arcadian, Corinthian, Mantinean, Phocian, and Locrian warriors. The primary reason behind the inability of Sparta and the Peloponnesian League to deploy their main armies lay once again in the religious prohibitions imposed by the Carnea festival, the same obstacle encountered during the Battle of Marathon and the concurrent sacred Olympic Games. This 7,000-strong contingent under Leonidas was, in fact, a rearguard force intended to hold the pass or be sacrificed in the process until the main army could be mobilized. Upon positioning themselves at the middle gate, the Greek forces immediately commenced fortification efforts. A stone defensive wall, the Phocian Wall, erected years prior by the local Phocian populace but reduced to ruins over time, was rebuilt and reinforced. This wall functioned not merely as a physical barrier, but as armor behind which the Greek phalanx could take shelter, rest, and shield themselves from Persian archery fire. Leonidas's strategic calculations encompassed not only the front line, but the rear as well. The existence of an exceedingly narrow goat path utilized by local shepherds named Anopeia, which circumvented the steep slopes of Mount Calidromus to emerge behind the pass, had been identified. Defending this path was of vital importance. If the Persians were to discover this route, it would signify the collapse of the entire defensive line. Leonidas delegated the duty of guarding this mountain pass to a 1,000-strong contingent of Phocian heavy infantry who were familiar with the local geography and stationed them upon the high slopes. Under the scorching August heat, a bronze wall of 7,000 men, backed by the restored ancient Phocian Wall, flanked by the waters of the Malian Gulf to the right, and the cliffs of Mount Calidromus to the left, achieved a complete tactical lockdown. As the colossal dust cloud of the Persian army materialized on the horizon, one of the greatest asymmetrical and biomechanical wars of attrition in the ancient world was about to commence within a 15-meter chokepoint. When the massive army of Xerxes I reached the northern entrance of the pass of Thermopylae, an attack order was not immediately issued. Upon observing the size of the Greek vanguard and the narrowness of the pass, the Achaemenid command echelon assumed this resistance to be a temporary suicidal inclination rather than a rational military strategy. Xerxes waited for exactly 4 days, calculating that the psychological terror generated by the sheer mass of his army would compel the Greeks to flee without a fight. However, while this 4-day period of inertia generated a massive logistical deficit for the Persian side, it afforded the Greek forces the opportunity to rest and reinforce their fortifications. With each passing day, the volume of water and grain consumed by hundreds of thousands of soldiers and horses escalated the tension within the Persian supply chain. At the dawn of the 5th day, when it became mathematically certain that psychological pressure had failed, Xerxes ordered the first physical assault. For the first assault wave, the Medes and Scythians, among the most martial peoples of the empire, were selected. These units were not trained in heavy infantry doctrine. Rather, they were light infantry formations designed to subject the enemy to a hail of arrows in open fields before crushing them with rapid maneuvers. The armor they bore generally consisted of thick textiles or leather. Their shields were woven from wicker, and their spears were relatively short. Upon entering the bottleneck of the 15-meter wide pass, these units confronted one of the most lethal biomechanical disparities in ancient military history. The moment of physical impact was not a tactical engagement, but rather a mass crushing within a narrow tube. When the Median and Sicyan units crashed against the Greek phalanx, which had forged an impenetrable wall of 90-centimeter oak and bronze-alloyed aspis shields, manned by soldiers clad in solid bronze armor weighing between 20 and 30 kilograms, their kinetic energy was entirely zeroed out. Moreover, the dory spears utilized by the Greek heavy infantry, crafted from ashwood and measuring 2.5 meters in length, provided a far more lethal reach than the Persian spears. Before the Persian soldiers could even reach the Greek armor with their own weapons, they fell victim to the bronze-tipped spears extending from behind the overlapping shield wall. The narrowness of the pass rendered the Persian numerical superiority entirely meaningless. The colossal human mass pressing from behind pushed the vanguard soldiers directly onto the Greek spears, compounding casualties through its own internal mechanics. During this systematic process of annihilation, the Spartans executed a feigned retreat tactic known as anachoresis, which demanded an exceptionally high degree of military discipline with flawless rhythm. The shield wall abruptly dissolved, and the Spartans began to run backward as if fleeing in panic. Mistaking this maneuver for a genuine rout, the Persian units entirely broke their formation and gave chase amid loud shouts. However, upon reaching a predetermined point, the Spartans pivoted on their heels within seconds, interlocked their shields once more, and butchered the disorganized, charging Persian soldiers like a massive bronze meat grinder. By the conclusion of the first day, the front of the pass was choked with thousands of Median and Sicyan corpses, and the ground before the Phocian wall had transformed into a bloody mire intermixed with the sulphurous hot springs. On the second day of battle, Xerxes deployed the empire's most elite, best equipped, and psychologically terrifying force, the Amartica, known to the Greeks as the 10,000-strong Immortals, in order to exact the toll of the first day's heavy casualties and decisively break the resistance. Commanded by Datis, this elite unit derived its name from the fact that its numbers never fell below 10,000. Every fallen or wounded soldier was immediately replaced. The Immortals marched toward the pass, exhibiting immense discipline, wielding superior weaponry, and wearing iron scale armor concealed beneath their cloth tunics. However, the entry of the Immortals into the pass and their collision with the Greek phalanx validated the unforgiving laws of military technology and geography once again. Metallurgical and biomechanical analyses clearly elucidate the anatomy behind the Immortals' failure. Although their iron scale armor provided vastly superior protection compared to the cloth armor of the Medes, it remained weak when contrasted with the solid bronze cuirasses, thorax, of the Greeks. More critically, the leather-covered wood and wicker shields borne by the Immortals, known as gera, were structurally inadequate to withstand the pressure of hundreds of kilograms of othismos, shield push, despite being excellent for halting a barrage of arrows. Furthermore, their spear lengths were still shorter than those of the Greeks. Within a 15-meter expanse, the greatest advantages of the Immortals, archery and maneuverability, were completely negated. When the clash devolved into a pure mass push and endurance test, the Greek phalanx, possessing heavier armor, larger shields and longer spears, annihilated the finest soldiers of the Achaemenid Empire with the same statistical coldness exhibited on the first day. The charge of the Immortals yielded no tactical outcome other than elevating the piles of corpses before the Phocian wall. The Persian mass, arriving in waves over the course of 2 days, shattered against the narrowness of the pass and the stoicism of bronze. The forensic tableau of the 2 days of combat depicted a stalemate wherein Greek casualties were kept to an absolute minimum, while Persian losses were quantified in the tens of thousands. Xerxes's brute force frontal assaults proved insufficient to break the geographical lock of Thermopylae. Yet, one of the immutable axioms of military history dictates that at the point where frontal assaults stall, intelligence intervenes. This mechanical knot at the pass was about to be untied not by swords, but by treachery. The tactical stalemate, enduring for 2 days within the 15-meter chokepoint at the pass of Thermopylae, culminating in the deaths of thousands of Achaemenid soldiers, stands as the most definitive forensic evidence of how sheer brute force and numerical superiority falter against geography. For the command staff of Xerxes I, it had become mathematically certain that frontal assaults had devolved into logistical waste and military suicide. In military historiographical doctrine, bypassing impassable frontal obstacles is a fundamental principle. However, the execution of this principle requires a vital component: flawless local intelligence. The wall of bronze shields at Thermopylae would collapse not by swords or spears, but by geography betraying itself as the result of a catastrophic intelligence breach. During the evening hours of the second day of battle, the approach of a local figure to the Achaemenid camp radically altered the anatomy of the war. Ephialtes, depicted by pop culture for centuries as a deformed monstrosity, was, in historical reality, devoid of any physical deformity. He was an ordinary shepherd and political opportunist native to the region of Malis. Possessing an intimate knowledge of the region's rugged topography, goat trails, and water sources since childhood, Ephialtes, in exchange for a colossal financial reward and political status from Xerxes, disclosed to the Persian command a secret mountain route that circumvented Mount Kallidromus and descended behind the pass of Thermopylae near the village of Alpanoi. This route, recorded in historical archives as the Anapeia Path, was a narrow goat track hugging the edges of steep precipices and cloaked by dense oak forests, entirely unsuitable for the march of massive armies. Yet this narrow path possessed sufficient physical width for that fatal tactical maneuver, which would alter the trajectory of the war. Xerxes immediately dispatched Hydarnes, the commander of the Immortals, to exploit this intelligence. Despite having sustained heavy casualties in the frontal assaults over the preceding 2 days, the Immortals remained the most disciplined and physically conditioned unit within the army. On the evening of the second day, as darkness fell and campfires were ignited, the Persian elites under the command of Hydarnes crossed the Asopus River under Ephialtes' guidance and commenced their ascent up the mountain slopes. This night march ranks among the most arduous and disciplined deployments in ancient military history. The magnitude of the operation becomes vividly clear when the chronology and physical conditions of the march are examined. Under the limited illumination of torchlight, upon gradients occasionally exceeding 30 degrees, the Persian soldiers were compelled to ascend to an altitude of approximately 1,000 meters above sea level. This climb, executed under the weight of weaponry, armor, and provisions, had to be conducted in absolute silence. A minor metallic clatter, or the cry of a falling soldier, could alert the Greek sentries on the mountain. The march consisted solely of gaining elevation from dusk until the late hours of the night, subsequently transitioning into a horizontal traverse along the ridgeline. According to the temporal calculations of forensic historiography, this deployment was a continuous forced march enduring between 8 to 10 hours, pushing the biomechanical limits of the soldiers within an environment characterized by thinning oxygen and chilling mountain winds. As the dawn of the third day began to break, Datis and his unit reached a plateau blanketed by dense oak forest near the summit of Mount Calidromus. Positioned precisely at this juncture was the 1,000-strong Phocian heavy infantry contingent stationed by King Leonidas to secure the rear of the pass. Leonidas had learned of the path's existence from the local populace and integrated it into his defensive blueprint. However, relying upon the ambient noise of the wind blowing throughout the night, the Phocian sentries perceived the approaching threat far too late. As ancient sources record with highly specific detail, the intense rustling produced by dry oak leaves being crushed beneath Persian feet, resembling the sound of a torrential downpour, triggered a state of high alarm within the Phocian encampment. Upon witnessing thousands of Persian soldiers suddenly materializing in the twilight of dawn, the Phocian hoplites hastily grasped their weapons and donned their armor. Confronted abruptly by bronze-armored Greeks, Datis experienced a brief moment of consternation, mistakenly assuming he had encountered the main Spartan army, and promptly ordered his archers into battle formation. As the first Persian arrows took flight, the colossal strategic error that would determine the fate of the war unfolded. The commanders of the Phocian contingent operated under the assumption that they were the primary and sole target of the Persian force. Instead of blocking the narrow path to form a shield wall, thereby obstructing the Persian advance with their own bodies within the chokepoint, they executed a tactical retreat toward the higher, steeper slopes of the mountain, where they calculated they could mount a superior defense. By withdrawing toward the summit, they awaited the Persian assault. While this decision was driven by a localized survival instinct, it yielded absolute ruin within the context of the overarching strategy. Datis's objective was not the annihilation of this minor unit on the mountain, but rather the traversing of the path to reach the main pass below. With the Phocians having vacated the path and ascended the slopes, Datis refused to engage them, ceased the archery barrage, and issued the order for his army to swiftly descend the eastern foothills of the mountain. This bloodless encounter upon the mountain marked the precise moment the defensive lock of Thermopylae was broken. As the Phocian unit continued to wait upon the slopes, the Persian immortals commenced their descent toward the village of Alpanoi, heading directly for the exposed rear of Leonidas and the 7,000-strong Greek army. Although the naval component of the double-envelopment operation had been thwarted by the Athenian fleet at Artemisium, this mountainous envelopment on the landward side was now on the verge of being completed with millimeter precision. For the Pan-Hellenic army defending the Hot Gates, time was now reduced to nothing more than a rapidly contracting circle. As the dawn of the third day of resistance at the pass of Thermopylae broke, intelligence reports arriving at the Greek command tent confirmed that the military situation had ceased to be a defensive war and had entered a process of mathematical annihilation. The whispers brought by Ionian informants fleeing Persian lines under the cover of darkness, and the frantic reports of Greek scouts descending from the mountain with the first light of morning corroborated the same forensic reality. The Anapaea path had fallen, and the Persian immortals, under the command of Datis, had begun their descent to envelop the rear of the Pan-Hellenic army. This moment marked a strategic breaking point in the anatomy of the battle. The pass was no longer a defensive wall, but a kill box sealed at both ends. Confronted with this concrete military data, King Leonidas I of Sparta made one of the most rational and cold-blooded tactical decisions in ancient Greek military history. Although pop culture frequently dramatizes this moment as a suicide pact or a legendary act of sacrifice, the exact equivalent of this decision in military literature is a rearguard action. Leonidas recognized that the annihilation of the bulk of his 7,000-strong army here would constitute an irrecoverable military casualty for the future defense of the Greek mainland. Consequently, the approximately 5,500 Peloponnesian heavy infantrymen constituting the main body of the army were issued immediate orders to retreat and evacuate toward Athens before the southern exit of the pass was entirely sealed. This evacuation strategically preserved the troops for utilization in future decisive pitched battles, such as the Battle of Plataea. However, for the evacuation to be successful, and for the main army to reach a safe distance without being struck from behind by Persian light cavalry, the Persian advance through the pass had to be physically blocked for a few more hours. The forensic breakdown of the units remaining in the pass to execute this duty extends far beyond the mythological figure of 300. In addition to Leonidas and his 300 elite Spartan guards, who were forbidden to retreat by Spartan law, 700 Thespian hoplites, under the command of Demophilus, voluntarily chose to remain, as their city lay directly on the Persian army's route of advance. They were joined by 400 Theban heavy infantrymen, whom Herodotus characterizes as political hostages, but who, in practical terms, fought until the very end. This rearguard force, comprising approximately 1,400 men in total, harbored a singular tactical objective: to hold the Persian army at the pass for the maximum possible duration, securing a vital window of time for the retreating main army, and inflicting maximum mechanical devastation upon the Achaemenid ranks. Once the evacuation was complete, and the Persian assault commenced in the later hours of the morning, Leonidas executed a strategic shift in positioning. Having held his army in a defensive posture at the narrow middle gate and behind the Phocian wall for the first 2 days, the Spartan king advanced his forces into the slightly wider expanse situated in front of the wall. This maneuver was not a defensive action, but rather an offensive mass charge aimed at entering a lethal war of attrition to inflict maximum possible damage upon the Persian vanguard. Upon observing that the Greeks' numbers had dwindled and they had abandoned their defensive lines, the Persian command echelon drove their units forward relentlessly. According to historical records, Persian officers compelled their soldiers forward with whips. This dynamic increased the physical pressure within the pass to such an extreme that thousands of Persian soldiers drowned after being pushed into the sea by the weight of their own units, or were crushed to death beneath the advancing mass before even reaching the Greek shields. Eventually, however, this colossal mass push began to fracture the flawless geometry of the Greek phalanx. The ferocity of the physical collision exceeded the material endurance limits of the weaponry. Following hours of shield bashing and impacts penetrating bone and armor, the 2.5-meter ashwood dory spears, the Greek infantry's greatest advantage, were largely shattered or splintered. With the loss of their spears, the phalanx formation ceased to function, and the clash devolved into the most chaotic, brutal, close-quarters combat phase of antiquity: short sword range. Drawing their double-edged straight swords, known as xephus, and their heavy, curved hacking swords, called kopis. The Greek hoplites engaged in a mechanical, hand-to-hand slaughter. From this point forward, the battle was no longer an application of strategy, but a mere autopsy table where flesh, bone, and bronze violently intersected. During this chaotic melee, King Leonidas of Sparta succumbed to countless blows and perished. In ancient military doctrine, the corpse of a king or commander-in-chief represents a massive psychological and political prize for both factions. The moment Leonidas's lifeless body fell to the earth, the entire physical momentum of the battle centralized around his remains. To prevent their king's corpse from falling into Persian hands and suffering desecration, the Spartans and Thespians quite literally forged a dome of shields over the body. According to forensic historical records, in this micro-engagement over Leonidas's corpse, the Greeks managed to repel the Persian elites 4 distinct times, successfully retrieving the body. This struggle was not born of romantic devotion, but was a lethal physical reaction executed to prevent the body from being converted into a political trophy. Toward midday, the war cries and the dust-raising cadence of the march approaching from the south heralded the final phase of the tactical meltdown. The Immortals, under Hydarnes's command, had navigated the Anapaea path, reached the southern extremity of the pass, and completely sealed the rear of the Greek rearguard. The double-envelopment was now physically complete. Recognizing the situation, the surviving Greeks abandoned the open field engagement and executed a final, disciplined retreat behind the Phocian wall. At this juncture, the 400 Theban heavy infantrymen laid down their arms and surrendered to the Persians, an objective fact acknowledged by forensic military history, despite attempts by certain Greek historians to obscure it for political motives. The remaining and rapidly dwindling Spartans and Thespians withdrew to the summit of a small earthen mound situated immediately behind the pass's wall, known as Kolonos. Continuing to fight with broken swords, shattered shields, and even their bare hands and teeth, this final shield wall formed an outward-facing circular defensive formation atop the hillock. However, Xerxes I had no intention of feeding more Persian infantry into this bronze meat grinder to eradicate this final pocket of resistance. Logistical and military rationality dictated the immediate cessation of close-quarters combat. The Persian infantry withdrew, and the mound was completely encircled by thousands of Persian archers. The event that transpired from this moment onward was not a battle, but a completely one-sided, ballistic execution. Tens of thousands of arrows, fired in parabolic arcs from Persian composite bows, descended upon the Kolonos hillock like a rain of iron and wood. Against this ranged assault, there remained no chance of tactical defense for the immobilized Greek soldiers, whose armor had already sustained severe damage from hours of combat and lost its structural integrity. The bronze cuirasses and oak shields withstood the successive ballistic pressure up to a certain threshold before physically collapsing. The last remaining Spartan and Thespian heavy infantrymen were systematically eradicated atop the Kolonos mound under the cumulative kinetic energy and piercing devastation of the arrows raining from afar, never to engage in hand-to-hand combat with Persian soldiers again. When the pass finally fell silent, the Hot Gates had officially fallen, and the gateway to central Greece was thrown wide open to the Achaemenid Empire. During the exact hours when the final shield wall atop the Kolonos mound was systematically eradicated, and physical resistance at the pass of Thermopylae was entirely silenced. A strategic rupture was unfolding in the Strait of Artemisium, the naval anchor of the dual defense lock. The unified Greek fleet, commanded by the Athenian naval architect Themistocles, had waged a relentless maritime war of attrition for 3 consecutive days against a vastly numerically superior Persian armada. However, the intelligence delivered to the Greek flagship by a 50-oared reconnaissance vessel, Pentaconta, dispatched from the Malian Gulf, shattered the entire military equation within seconds. The incoming message was clinical and unequivocal. The pass had fallen. King Leonidas of Sparta had been killed, and tens of thousands of infantrymen from the Achaemenid army had begun pouring southward. The strategic translation of this forensic data meant that the symbiotic bond between the land and naval forces had been severed. For the Greek fleet to remain at Artemisium would no longer yield any tactical advantage. Conversely, it carried the imminent risk of having their naval bases seized by the Persian ground army maneuvering behind them, leading to the fleet's total annihilation within a massive encirclement. Comprehending the gravity of the situation, Themistocles immediately issued an order for a strict, disciplined night withdrawal. Under the cover of darkness, the Greek triremes abandoned the Strait of Artemisium and initiated a highly critical, strategic redeployment southward along the Attica Peninsula toward the Saronic Gulf, specifically into the narrow straits of the island of Salamis. With the blockage at the funnel of Thermopylae removed, the Persian administrative and military machine burst onto the plains of central Greece like a breached dam. The regions of Phocis and Boeotia, now devoid of any pan-Hellenic defensive line to protect them in the north, became the direct targets of imperial wrath. The massive logistical chain of the Achaemenid army, its supply reserves depleted to the point of exhaustion after days of waiting at the pass, commandeered the agricultural resources of these regions to replenish itself. Cities that demonstrated resistance were set ablaze and erased from the map with millimeter precision. Meanwhile, cities like Thebes, which had previously exhibited inclinations to submit to the Persians, Medism, officially surrendered to the empire, placing all their military and logistical resources at the disposal of Xerxes I. Extricated from a 15-meter chokepoint, the hundreds of thousands-strong army resumed its relentless march toward the campaign's ultimate political objective, the region of Attica and its heart, Athens. When the news that Persian vanguard units had crossed the borders of Attica reached Athens, the city became the stage for one of the most colossal civilian and logistical evacuations the ancient world had ever witnessed. Interpreting the Delphic oracle's prophecy that only wooden walls could protect the city within a rational military framework as a reference to wooden ships, Themistocles convinced the Athenian assembly to evacuate the city entirely. The maritime transport of a civilian population numbering approximately 100,000, comprising women, children, and the elderly, to the islands of Salamis and Aegina, as well as to the Troezen coastlines on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, represents an organizational genius at least equal to winning a pitched battle. In late September of 480 BCE, when the Achaemenid army entered Athens, they encountered a completely abandoned, veritable ghost city. Only a small contingent of priests and civilians remained, having barricaded themselves behind the wooden gates of the Acropolis, clinging to the belief that the prophecy's wooden walls were literal physical barriers. They were swiftly annihilated by Persian infantry. By the order of Xerxes I, the city of Athens, along with its temples, monuments, and the Acropolis, was systematically set ablaze. These colossal flames, visible from the waters off Salamis and painting the sky crimson, entered historical records as the physical manifestation of the vows of vengeance initiated by Darius I a decade earlier with the burning of Sardis. Within the context of military history and logistical doctrines, whether the Battle of Thermopylae constituted a massive strategic victory or a futile sacrifice remains a subject of profound academic analysis. From a strict operational standpoint, Xerxes I achieved his objectives. The pass was breached, the Greek rearguard army was annihilated, and Athens was reduced to ash. However, the logistical dimension of the coin presents an entirely different forensic conclusion. The 1-week delay engineered by Leonidas and his men at the Hot Gates forced the colossal Persian army to consume massive quantities of provisions and water in enemy territory, precisely where their supply lines were most vulnerable. More vitally, this 7-day biomechanical resistance provided Themistocles with the necessary time to evacuate the civilian population of Athens, enabled the unified army on the Peloponnesian Peninsula to construct an insurmountable wall across the Isthmus of Corinth, and allowed the Greek fleet to safely redeploy from Artemisium to Salamis. The blood mingled with the earth, and the bronze shattered before the Phocian wall did not win the war directly. Rather, it purchased the most expensive and valuable currency in military logistics: time. The time thus gained would be transformed into an ultimate geopolitical victory just weeks later, within the dark, narrow waters of Salamis, by the battering rams of the Greek triremes. The withdrawal of the Greek fleet from the War of Attrition in the Strait of Artemisium and its subsequent anchoring along the coast of Attica, specifically within the narrow waters between the island of Salamis and the mainland, was not merely a geographical relocation. It was the physical manifestation of the deepest strategic fracture within the Pan-Hellenic alliance. In late September of 480 BCE, the Greek naval command gathered on the shores of Salamis to convene a council of war that would dictate the trajectory of the conflict. The fundamental debate within this council was not predicated upon heroism or patriotism, but rather upon pure military geography and the mathematics of survival. The military doctrine of the nominal commander-in-chief of the unified fleet, the Spartan Eurybiades, along with the other allied admirals from the Peloponnese, was rooted in a linear and defensive logic. According to their strategic blueprint, the fleet was to immediately abandon Salamis and withdraw southward to the Isthmus of Corinth. The flanks of the defensive wall to be erected on land were to be protected by the navy, and the battle was to be accepted at the borders of the Peloponnese. However, this plan was rejected by the architect of the Athenian navy, Themistocles, with a rigid geopolitical and hydrodynamic objection. According to Themistocles' analysis, engaging in a battle off the Isthmus of Corinth, that is, within expansive maritime zones, would entirely favor the numerically superior, lighter, and highly maneuverable Persian, Phoenician, and Ionian vessels. In open waters, hundreds of Persian ships would possess the physical expanse required to envelop the Greek flanks within seconds, annihilating the entire fleet. Themistocles proposed an inversion of established military doctrine. The singular location where numerical superiority would devolve from an asset into a lethal vulnerability was the narrow waters of the Strait of Salamis, where ships would be unable to maneuver and would inevitably pile upon one another. At the juncture where diplomatic persuasion stalled, Themistocles issued a cold-blooded political ultimatum, threatening to withdraw from the alliance with Athens's 200 triremes and relocate the entire Athenian populace to Italy. Confronted with this mathematical imperative, Eurybiades and the allies were compelled to accept the strategy of remaining at Salamis. As the strategic theatre of the war was thus established, examining the engineering and biomechanical anatomy of the primary mechanism destined to clash within these waters, the trireme, a warship with 3 banks of oars, is imperative to comprehend the nature of the impending violence. The trireme, representing the zenith of ancient Mediterranean naval warfare technology, was a floating weapon measuring approximately 35 to 40 meters in length, boasting a maximum beam of 5 meters and possessing a draft of merely 1 meter. Yet, what rendered this vessel the most lethal machine of the ancient world was not its sails, but its internal engine, entirely reliant upon human muscle power. An examination of the internal structure of an Athenian trireme reveals that the ship was not merely a wooden hull, but simultaneously an organic, biomechanical system. The vessel's propulsive force consisted of precisely 170 men, seated in 3 distinct tiers: thranetai, zigitai, thalametai, along both sides of the hull operating the oars. Upon transitioning to a combat state and accelerating to ramming speed, approximately 10 knots or 18 kilometers per hour, the lower decks of the ship descended into a dark inferno. The oxygen consumption generated by 170 men rowing simultaneously with maximum muscular exertion was of colossal magnitude. The accumulation of carbon dioxide within the poorly ventilated lower decks, coupled with body temperatures surging within seconds, and the evaporation of gallons of sweat, forged a claustrophobic environment that mercilessly tested the physical endurance limits of the oarsmen. The synchronization of this human engine within the wooden hull had to be millimeter precise. Even a 1-second delay in the tempo dictated by the rowing master, known as the kaleustes, utilizing a flute or rhythmic wooden strikes, could cause the oars to entangle, resulting in a total loss of momentum and instantly transforming the ship into a sitting target for the enemy. The foundational philosophy of trireme engineering was predicated upon speed and lightness. Consequently, the hulls were constructed not from heavy, durable woods such as oak, but from the flexible and lightweight pine. However, the structurally spongy texture of pine engendered the greatest logistical handicap of the triremes: the issue of water absorption. A trireme left in the water for prolonged periods would absorb tons of seawater into its hull, becoming heavy, sluggish, and prone to sinking. This physical reality elucidates why ancient navies were incapable of remaining on the open sea overnight, and were strictly compelled to be hauled ashore and beached for drying every evening. The Greek crews stationed on the shores of Salamis executed this vital drying procedure daily by hauling their vessels onto the beaches. The entirety of a trireme's biomechanical exertion and hydrodynamic design served a singular metallurgical purpose carried upon its prow: the embalon, or the battering ram. Affixed to the forward extending extremity of the main keel, situated just below the waterline, was a massive, bronze-cast ram weighing up to 200 kilograms. The embalon did not possess a sharp, spear-like tip. Rather, it featured a blunt structure, typically comprising 3 horizontal blades. The engineering ingenuity behind this was exceptionally sharp. A pointed ram could penetrate deeply and become lodged within the enemy hull, potentially dragging the attacking vessel down to the seabed alongside the sinking adversary. In contrast, a blunt, three-bladed embolon would strike directly at the wooden joints, the caulking, of the enemy ship, executing a lethal transfer of kinetic energy. It would warp the hull, pop its nails, and inflict a massive structural failure that allowed tons of water to flood the interior. The impact of a mass approaching 90 tons, striking a target at a velocity of 5 meters per second, equated to a mechanical devastation, comparable to the ballistic missiles of antiquity. When analyzing the naval architectures of the two fleets destined to clash in the waters of Salamis, the structural asymmetry that ultimately dictated victory emerges with absolute clarity. The Phoenician, Egyptian, and Ionian vessels that constituted the backbone of Xerxes I's armada were naval crafts constructed from high-quality timber, dried for months by master shipwrights. They were relatively lighter, possessed high maneuverability, and featured elevated decks, high freeboards, specifically designed to accommodate archers. In open waters, these ships were invincible due to their speed and agility. Conversely, the Athenian navy was not the product of years of meticulous planning, but rather the result of a colossal and urgent shipbuilding program hastily initiated by Themistocles, financed through the revenues of the Laurian silver mines. To expedite construction, insufficiently dried, freshly cut, green timber had been utilized in the vessels. This condition rendered the Greek ships substantially heavier than their theoretical design weights, inherently slower, and restricted in their maneuverability. Furthermore, because they carried heavily armed infantry, hoplites, their decks sat closer to the waterline, resulting in a significantly lower center of gravity. This heavy and sluggish profile, which appeared to be an engineering flaw and a speed disadvantage in a theoretical context, was about to transform into the greatest tactical advantage in ancient historical literature under the windy and narrow conditions of the Strait of Salamis. While the light and towering Phoenician ships, engineered for speed on the open sea, would be battered and tossed by crosswinds and water currents in the narrow strait due to their high centers of gravity. The heavy, low-riding Greek ships, built with green timber, would exhibit an unshakable hydrodynamic stability amidst the turbulent waters, and in the moment of a kinetic collision, the heavier mass invariably shatters the lighter one. As these structural discrepancies in the hulls were established, and the debates within the council concluded, only a single step remained for the great mass velocity equation upon the sea to commence. Persuading Xerxes I and his massive armada to forfeit their safety in the open waters and enter this narrow, lethal strait where the physical laws of wood and bronze reigned supreme. As strategy yielded to the machinations of intelligence, the fate of the ancient world would be thrust onto the shoulders of a slave belonging to Themistocles. The diplomatic consensus within the command echelon of the unified Greek fleet, anchored in the waters of Salamis, experienced a structural collapse as the massive flames rising from the Athenian Acropolis painted the night sky crimson. Although the theoretical decision dictated remaining at Salamis, the factions formed by the Peloponnesian admirals, confronting the reality that there was no remaining landmass behind them to defend, initiated panicked preparations to divide the fleet and flee to the Isthmus of Corinth. The Athenian strategist Themistocles, with rational cold-bloodedness, analyzed that the alliance was on the verge of fracturing along a millimeter-precise fault line, and that military diplomacy had been rendered entirely obsolete. The singular method to prevent the physical dissolution of the Allies was to confine them within a geographical trap from which they could not escape, transmuting the battle from a matter of choice into a stark necessity of life and death. Pursuant to this strategic objective, Themistocles set into motion a flawless disinformation operation that would rewrite the military intelligence doctrines of antiquity. The conduit for this operation was not a warrior or an admiral, but a loyal slave named Sisinus, the tutor to Themistocles' children, who spoke fluent Persian. Under the pitch-black cover of night, Sisinus secretly departed Salamis in a small boat and infiltrated the central headquarters of the colossal Achaemenid fleet, which was anchored across the Saronic Gulf in the Bay of Phaleron. Brought before the general staff of Xerxes I, the fabricated intelligence dossier presented by Sisinus was constructed upon the most dangerous weapon in the art of psychological warfare: partial truth. Sisinus reported that the Greek commanders were divided among themselves, gripped by terror, and actively preparing to fragment the fleet and flee to Corinth before daybreak. Furthermore, he declared that Themistocles harbored a secret desire to defect to the Persian king, asserting that if the Persian armada were to seal the exits of the strait at midnight, the Greeks would turn upon themselves and surrender without a single arrow being loosed. This disinformation was accepted as absolute reality by Xerxes I and his command echelon without a shred of suspicion. The mechanism underlying this unquestioning acceptance was not Persian hubris. Rather, it was confirmation bias, compounded by the colossal logistical time pressure generated by the encroaching winter. Logistically, Xerxes was already compelled to conclude the naval war with utmost urgency, and the prospect of the Greeks fleeing aligned flawlessly with his preconceived strategic paradigm. The opportunity to immediately annihilate or capture the Greek fleet precisely where it lay anchored exerted an irresistible allure over the Persian headquarters. The emperor immediately ordered the entire armada to a state of high alert at midnight, commanding the physical blockade of both exits to the Strait of Salamis. With the issuance of this order, the fundamental biomechanical and physiological asymmetry that would dictate the fate of the battle was set into motion. Hundreds of Persian warships sailed into the pitch-black waters of the Saronic Gulf, propelled by the simultaneous exertion of approximately 50,000 oarsmen. The Egyptian naval squadron was dispatched on a prolonged night maneuver, ordered to circumnavigate the island of Salamis and blockade the Megara Channel to prevent any Greek escape to the west. Meanwhile, the Phoenician and Ionian fleets, forming the central spine of the armada, were arrayed side by side to seal the eastern exit of the strait. However, nocturnal navigation was an exceptionally hazardous and energy-consuming endeavor in ancient seafaring. To avert collisions and avoid arousing the Greeks, an order of absolute silence had been imposed. In the depths of the night, any opportunity for rest was entirely eradicated for the Persian oarsmen. The ships did not drop anchor. Instead, to prevent currents and winds from driving the vessels ashore or into one another, the rowers were forced to execute continuous station-keeping maneuvers for hours on end. In the context of anatomy and sports physiology, this translated to a massive accumulation of lactic acid and the rapid depletion of glycogen stores. The isometric and isotonic muscle contractions expended to hold nearly 40-ton wooden masses steady against the current surged their oxygen consumption, pushing the Persian oarsmen to the absolute precipice of physical exhaustion as dawn approached. Millions of calories of cellular energy were squandered in the dark waters, merely to maintain position. before the first contact of the battle had even occurred. While the Persian armada operated under the mental anticipation of an enemy fleeing in panic, physiologically, it was slowly drifting into total collapse. Merely 2 kilometers across the water, on the shores of Salamis, a diametrically opposed logistical reality was unfolding. Thanks to Themistocles' strategic brilliance, when intelligence that the strait had been completely sealed reached the Greek headquarters, all debates regarding flight naturally ceased, and the transition to a battle-ready state commenced. The Greek oarsmen had spent the night sleeping ashore, outside their vessels, gathered around campfires. Their muscles were rested, their lactic acid levels reset to 0. And by morning, having nourished themselves with high-carbohydrate barley bread and wine, their glycogen reserves were fully replenished. Before the 2 forces even clashed at the break of dawn, the victor, in terms of energy and cellular readiness, had already been biologically predetermined. As the final strategic maneuver of the night, Xerxes I disembarked his most elite heavy infantry, a detachment of the Immortals, onto the small island of Psyttaleia, a geographical linchpin situated at the entrance of the strait. The tactical objective of this contingent was to systematically slaughter any Greeks attempting to swim ashore from sinking vessels once the battle commenced, while simultaneously rescuing Persian sailors suffering the same fate. As these elite infantrymen set foot upon the rocky terrain of Psyttaleia, they were not yet aware that they had effectively imprisoned themselves upon an isolated landmass in the middle of the strait, wholly dependent on naval supremacy. As dawn broke and the Saronic Gulf began to illuminate, the Persian armada, having rowed against the current in the dark for hours and debilitated by sleep deprivation, did not witness a disorganized Greek fleet fleeing in panic and crashing into one another, as they had anticipated. Instead, the silence of the night and the lapping of the sea were torn asunder by the paean, the ancient hymn of battle, chanted simultaneously by thousands of men with rhythmic and unshakable discipline, echoing from the shores of Salamis. The intelligence trap had snapped shut. The Achaemenid armada was condemned to wait exactly at the hour Themistocles desired, at the precise level of exhaustion he intended, right at the mouth of that lethal narrow strait where maneuverability was impossible. The transfer of mass upon the water's surface was now left entirely to the mercy of the wind and bronze. In late September of 480 BCE, as the sun began to rise over the waters of the Saronic Gulf, the largest armada of the ancient world had taken its position at the eastern entrance of the Strait of Salamis, poised for action. To oversee this military transfer of mass and document the victory that was believed to be an absolute certainty, the Achaemenid Emperor, Xerxes I, had a colossal golden throne erected upon the foothills of Mount Aigaleo, a vantage point that commanded total visual dominion over the battlefield. This act was not merely a display of monarchical hubris. It was a functional component of the empire's rigid military bureaucracy. Xerxes was surrounded by imperial scribes tasked with recording, with millimeter precision, which ship captains demonstrated valor and which retreated during the engagement. This high-altitude observation post, gazing down from the mountain slopes upon the waters of the strait, allowed the geopolitical and tactical lines of the battle to be read as clearly as a map. Yet, the singular factor that Xerxes could not perceive from his elevated perch was that victory was about to be dictated not by swords or sheer numbers, but by atmospheric pressure differentials and the laws of hydrodynamics. In the early hours of the morning, an exceptionally specific and localized meteorological shift initiated across the waters of the strait. The thermal equilibrium, established throughout the night by the differential cooling rates of land and sea, was shattered with the sunrise. The terrestrial mass of the Attic Peninsula rapidly heated, causing the air above it to rise. This pressure differential triggered a powerful morning sea breeze blowing from the Saronic Gulf toward the land, reaching velocities of 20 to 30 kilometers per hour. This wind current, which facilitated sailing on the expansive open seas, became compressed upon entering the funnel-like narrow strait between Salamis and the mainland. It accelerated, fracturing the surface tension of the sea and generating violent, short-interval chop. The physical impact of this meteorological shift upon the battle formations of the Persian Armada was immediate and devastating. The Phoenician vessels, constituting the primary striking force of the Persian navy, had been constructed with long, slender hulls and high freeboards to ensure speed and superior maneuverability on the open ocean. Furthermore, stationed upon the upper decks of these ships were heavily armored Persian, Median, and Saka marines. As the crosswinds struck, and the turbulent waters of the strait battered the hulls from below, this high center of gravity was transmuted into a fatal engineering vulnerability. The loss of stability upon the water's surface induced a pendulum effect. The high-sided Phoenician ships began to roll violently from side to side. This rolling was not merely an inconvenience inducing seasickness among the crew. In trireme engineering, it signified the absolute zeroing of propulsive power. As the ship listed, the oars of the uppermost tier of rowers, the thranetae, swung uselessly in the air, while the oars of the lowest tier plunged deep into the sea, becoming snagged. The delicate biomechanical synchronization reliant upon 170 men rowing simultaneously collapsed in an instant. Oars clashed against one another and splintered, and the forward momentum of the vessels halted. Attempting to resist the wind and waves within a confined space, the light-hulled Persian ships lost their maneuverability, beginning to devolve into massive wooden structures, drifting uncontrollably across the sea. On the opposing side of the strait, the meteorological conditions were yielding an entirely disparate hydrodynamic outcome. The Athenian vessels, hastily constructed with wet, heavy pine using Laurian silver, exhibited flawless equilibrium in these turbulent waters, owing to their low freeboards and deeply submerged heavy hulls. Rather than being tossed upon the waves, the waterlogged wooden hulls cleaved through the water, remaining stable and permitting the oarsmen to maintain their rhythmic strokes. Observing the Persian armada attempting to navigate the strait amidst this loss of balance and coordination breakdown, the Greek command echelon executed one of the most disciplined tactical maneuvers in history. Instead of launching a direct assault upon the Persian vessels, the Greek fleet initiated a synchronized withdrawal maneuver, known in ancient naval terminology as anacrusis. This maneuver entailed maintaining the prows and their lethal battering rams facing the enemy, while the oarsmen rowed in reverse, gradually gliding the ships backward toward the shore. For Xerxes, observing this maneuver from his golden throne on Mount Aigaleo, and for the Persian admirals attempting to enter the strait, this withdrawal appeared as the absolute corroboration of the fabricated intelligence delivered by Sisinus the previous night. Believing the Greeks to be fleeing in terror and their defenses collapsing, the Persian armada tightened its ranks and advanced deeper into the strait with immense appetite. However, this advance was not a strategic progression. It was, in the most literal sense, the act of being drawn into a kill box. As the Greeks retreated backward, the Persian fleet was compelled to enter the increasingly narrowing sections of the strait to pursue them. The strait, which measured 2 kilometers at its widest point, contracted to under 1.5 kilometers between the promontories of the island of Salamis and the Attic coast. At this juncture, the strategic catastrophe manifested as a problem of geometry and volume. The physical narrowness of the strait rendered it mathematically impossible for hundreds of Persian ships to simultaneously occupy the front line. As the Persian vessels in the rear ranks pressed forward, driven by the desire to engage in the battle and catch the eye of their emperor, the ships in the vanguard became severely compressed. Trapped under the pressure of the coastlines to their right and left, and the weight of their own colossal fleet from behind, the Persian vanguard forces could not find even a millimeter of water surface upon which to maneuver, deploy sails, or flank the enemy. The oars of the ships became hopelessly entangled, and the hulls of allied vessels scraped against one another, splintering the wood. As the hours progressed in the waters of Salamis, numerical superiority mutated from a military advantage into an inescapable traffic jam and a massive pileup. The direction of the wind, the center of gravity of the ships, and the geometric constriction of the strait intersected at a single focal point, precisely along that specific choke line where the Greeks intended them to be. The monumental armada that the Achaemenid Empire had brought forth to conquer the sea had now lost its offensive capability, devolving into a colossal mass of timber incapable of maneuver, wrestling with the waves and crushing itself beneath its own weight. When the betrayal of the wind and the geographical trap were fully realized, Themistocles observed that the anticipated hydrodynamic deadlock had materialized. Once the mechanical compression upon the water reached its maximum threshold, a single order issued from the Greek command ship would transmute the defensive action into an unprecedented kinetic assault. Henceforth, upon the sea, strategy would yield the floor to pure mass, velocity, and the shattering power of bronze. When the hydrodynamic deadlock in the waters of the Strait of Salamis reached its maximum physical limits, and the morning breeze of the Saronic Gulf entirely dismantled the stabilization of the Persian vessels, the passive maneuvering phase of the battle definitively concluded. The synchronized reverse rowing, anacrusis, executed by the Greek triremes, their prows locked onto the enemy, was abruptly halted by the sharp, piercing blare of bronze war trumpets, salpinks, rising from the command ships. This auditory signal served as a physiological trigger for the thousands of Greek oarsmen beneath the wooden decks. The rhythm of muscle contraction altered within seconds. Oars were plunged into the water at the optimal angle and with maximum exertion, surging the ship's momentum from a standstill to ramming speed, approximately 18 kilometers per hour, or 10 knots. This was the threshold where strategic anticipation yielded to the most intense and violent kinetic collision sequence of the ancient world. The anatomy of the collision must be examined not as military bravado, but as a problem of pure, unforgiving physics. A Greek trireme cleaving through the water constituted a wet wooden mass of approximately 90 tons. Directing this colossal mass toward a target at a velocity of 5 meters per second accumulated immense destructive power at the tip of the 200-kilogram bronze ram, Emberlon, upon its prow. When the classical kinetic energy equation of physics is applied to the waters of Salamis, the resulting energy was of a magnitude not merely to jolt a ship, but to instantaneously pulverize its structural skeleton with ballistic devastation. As the Greek rams struck the vulnerable lateral hulls of the Persian ships at a perpendicular angle, the blunt, three-bladed bronze tips did not merely pierce the thin cedar wood, they directly ruptured the caulking of the wooden planking, flexed the keel, and collapsed the structural integrity within seconds. The severity of the impact was so immense that tons of seawater flooded through the massive gashes, causing the high freeboard Phoenician and Ionian vessels to immediately capsize or be dragged straight to the bottom. For the Persian and allied oarsmen rowing in the lower decks, this condition mutated into a dark, claustrophobic, and inescapable hydrodynamic tomb. The element that transmuted this mechanical devastation into a systematic slaughter was the execution of two ancient naval tactics by the Greek fleet, applied with flawless discipline within the confined space: the diekplaus, breaking the line, and the periplus, flanking. Due to the narrowness of the strait, the Persian ships had assumed positions so close to one another that their maneuvering corridors were entirely sealed. Utilizing the diekplaus tactic, Greek captains drove their vessels rapidly into these narrow gaps. As they passed between two Persian ships, the Greek oarsmen, upon command at the very last second, retracted their oars into the hull, clearing the water. Simultaneously, their bronze rams and heavy pine hulls literally sheared off the extended oars of the Persian vessels. A warship stripped of dozens of its oars in seconds instantly loses its steering and propulsive capabilities, becoming a blind, paralyzed wooden mass drifting idly upon the sea. These incapacitated vessels, crippled by broken oars, were subsequently and systematically sunk through the periplus tactic, wherein Greek ships executed sharp turns to deliver lethal ramming strikes against the now defenseless broadsides. The tactical collapse within the Persian lines was not confined to the fragmentation of the vanguard. It compounded exponentially through a logistical catastrophe engineered within the rear ranks of the massive armada. The Persian and allied ships waiting at the entrance of the strait, optically oblivious to the devastation unfolding on the front lines, relentlessly pressed forward, driven by the instinct to catch the eye of Xerxes and claim a share of the battle. The rear rank surging forward, colliding with the vanguard ships attempting to retreat, generated a horrifying physical pileup in the middle of the narrow strait. The congestion reached such an extreme that Persian ships began colliding with one another more frequently than with the Greeks, shattering the oars of their allies and splintering the hulls of friendly vessels. The surface of the water became choked with broken oars, fragmented wooden hulls, and elite Persian, Median, and Saka marines who, spilling into the sea, were immediately dragged to the bottom by the weight of their heavy armor. The chaos escalated to a density and mechanical irreversibility that no chain of command could unravel. At the exact epicenter of this unbridled turmoil occurred one of the most pragmatic and ruthless tactical maneuvers in forensic military history. The ship commanded by Queen Artemisia, the first of Caria, Halicarnassus, a female admiral serving in the Persian armada, was being relentlessly pursued by an Athenian trireme commanded by Amanius of Pallene. Artemisia's escape route was inadvertently blocked by an allied Calindian vessel under the command of King Damosithemos. Trapped between the risk of being sunk by the Greeks and the traffic generated by allied ships, Artemisia solved the survival equation through an act of extraordinarily cold-blooded violence. She pivoted the prow of her ship directly toward the allied Calindian vessel and delivered a fatal broadside ram. The shattered Calindian ship sank to the bottom of the sea within seconds, taking its entire crew with it. This deliberate act of friendly fire manipulated the optical chaos upon the water entirely in Artemisia's favor. Upon witnessing Artemisia sink an allied Persian vessel, Achaemenid, the captain of the pursuing Athenian ship, fell under the misconception that she was a defecting Ionian ship or a secret Greek ally. He immediately abandoned the pursuit and diverted to other targets. This lethal maneuver not only spared her from the Greeks, but also generated one of the greatest ironies of historical optical perception. Xerxes I, seated upon his golden throne at the foothills of Mount Aigaleo, observing the turmoil in the strait, wholly misinterpreted the event due to the distance, the visual obstruction created by splintered wood, and the perspective distortion inherent in failing to discern the nationality of sinking ships. Convinced that Artemisia had sunk a Greek vessel, Xerxes turned to the imperial scribes around him and uttered the famous, yet factually flawed observation that would enter military history. "My men have become women, and my women men." This statement stands as the definitive forensic evidence of how profoundly a monarch was detached from the tactical reality on the ground. At sea level, while the Imperial Armada was experiencing the greatest physical destruction in its history beneath its own weight, entangled oars, and the ballistic pressure of Greek rams, the command center at the summit was merely applauding misunderstood individual actions. As the climax concluded, the waters of the Strait of Salamis were dyed red, and the spine of Achaemenid naval power was irreparably broken. On that long September day in 480 BCE, as the sun vanished behind Mount Aigaleo and the shadows of evening descended upon the waters of the Saronic Gulf, the physical anatomy of the Strait of Salamis had entirely transformed. Following a day-long succession of violent kinetic collisions, splintered pine and cedar hulls, and hundreds of tons of bronze rams dragged beneath the waves, the surface of the sea had mutated into the most colossal military landfill and hydrodynamic wreckage the ancient world had ever witnessed. During the evening hours, shifting coastal currents swept the shattered keels, broken oars, and the corpses of thousands of Persian, Median, and Phoenician sailors who had drowned, unable to swim due to their heavy armor, toward the Attic shoreline, specifically toward Cape Coleus. This tableau of silent and mechanical devastation upon the water served not merely as the loss of an ally for the Achaemenid ground army waiting and observing from the land, but literally as the prelude to an impending biological catastrophe. The seemingly invincible Persian army of hundreds of thousands, which had reduced Athens to ruins, burned its temples, and established absolute terrestrial supremacy across the Attic Peninsula, was instantaneously confronted with a state of logistical paralysis concurrent with this collapse at sea level. The most unforgiving axiom of military logistical doctrine is the reality that massive armies cannot survive solely by consuming the territories they conquer. Xerxes I's army had long since exhausted the limited agricultural resources of Attica. The army's daily requirement of hundreds of thousands of liters of water and thousands of tons of grain was sustained by massive supply vessels departing from the Levant and Egypt, escorted by the navy. The fracturing of the Achaemenid naval spine at Salamis meant that these maritime supply lines were left entirely defenseless and effectively severed. When the impending halt of maritime transport due to the onset of winter storms in the Aegean Sea was compounded upon this logistical nightmare, the Persian ground army was left facing not enemy combatants, but the insurmountable threat of cellular starvation. However, the forensic and strategic situational assessment conducted within Xerxes I's command tent that night focused upon a geopolitical nightmare far greater than troop malnutrition, one that threatened the very existence of the empire. The most critical data on the table was not the fate of Athens or Greece, but the physical security of the engineering marvels that were the pontoon bridges at the Hellespont, the Dardanelles. This artificial passageway, constructed by lashing hundreds of ships together with cables, constituted the sole secure umbilical cord connecting Xerxes and his colossal army to Asia. With the annihilation of the Persian fleet at Salamis, the naval initiative had passed entirely into the hands of the Greeks. The prospect of the undamaged and highly motivated Greek fleet swiftly sailing north to sever the bridges at the Hellespont was no longer a mere military possibility, but an imminent tactical inevitability. If the bridges were destroyed, the Lord of Asia and the most elite military mass of the empire would be trapped on the European continent, left to face starvation and mutiny in an enemy geography in the dead of winter, without any supply support. For an emperor to remain absent from his capitals of Susa or Persepolis for such an extended duration, trapped in Europe, posed a political risk lethal enough to instantly trigger internal rebellions and dynastic struggles within the Achaemenid bureaucratic structure. In light of these verifiable geopolitical data, Xerxes I, unclouded by hubris or sentiments of vengeance, rendered one of the most rational and cold-blooded decisions in ancient military history: a strategic evacuation and an immediate retreat to Asia. Merely a few days after the defeat at Salamis, the colossal ground army holding Athens was issued the order to march north, back toward the Hellespont. This return march devolved from a military deployment into a ruthless race against time and starvation. The Persian army, which had consumed all regional resources months prior while advancing south through central Greece, Thessaly, Macedonia, and Thrace, now encountered a literal, logistical desert upon traversing the exact same route. As historical sources explicitly document, tens of thousands of soldiers, unable to procure food, attempted to survive by consuming tree bark and wild grasses. The ensuing malnutrition and lack of hygiene triggered epidemics such as dysentery and plague. The mass of the army that ultimately reached the Hellespont suffered monumental casualties, not by Greek swords, but due to the unforgiving biomechanics of nature and starvation. Upon reaching their destination, they would discover that the bridges had already been dismantled by storms, though the surviving remnants of the fleet awaited to ferry them to the Asian shore. Nevertheless, Xerxes did not leave Greece entirely uncontested. The strategic intellect of the empire calculated the maximum number of troops the region's logistical capacity could sustain during the winter months, and left behind a reduced force strictly adhering to this mathematical equation. Entrusted to the command of the highly capable general Mardonius was not a massive horde, but a scaled-down yet exceptionally lethal combat force, comprised of highly mobile, elite heavy infantry, a detachment of the Immortals, and the heavy cavalry that formed the heart of Persian military doctrine. This force was designed to overwinter in the fertile plains of Thessaly and Boeotia. Mardonius's mandate was to consolidate diplomacy and military operations in the subsequent spring, completing the unfinished campaign and moving the war to the plains of Plataea. In the ultimate forensic analysis, the position of the Battle of Salamis in historical literature is not the shallow ideological narrative of a clash between good and evil, or East and West. This battle stands as a manifesto of ruthless logistical bankruptcy, proving the absolute biological dependence of massive continental empires upon maritime supply lines. Themistocles' strategy, combined with the meteorology of the Saronic Gulf and the hydrodynamics of heavy wooden hulls, did not merely sink hundreds of ships. It severed the largest military supply chain the ancient world had ever witnessed in a single blow. The mass of the water dictated its own laws to the mass of the land. The Achaemenid Empire's capacity for westward expansion was checked not by the shields of Athenian hoplites, but by the broken keels of Phoenician vessels, unable to withstand the sea breeze. That silent wreckage upon the sea, brimming with fragmented timber, was permanently etched into the cold, immutable archives of history as the most vivid, optical proof of the strategic deadlock and paralysis experienced by an overextended continental administrative apparatus when confronted by the unyielding laws of geography and physics. That brings us to the end of our video. Thank you for joining us for tonight's story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We would also love to hear your ideas and suggestions in the comments, so we can keep creating even better content for you. Hope to see you in the next video.